Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to our webinar today. I have just a few announcements to make before we begin. First, beware, we are recording this webinar as we always do, and it will be available on the SIETAR Europa YouTube channel that you can access directly through the site. Please note that during the webinar, you're invited to put comments or questions in the chat box, which you should find in your bar on Zoom. Now we have an interesting, if I could say, little technical issue today, which is Ariane can't follow the chat. Please be reassured, I will be doing that, and when he stops for questions, I'll be able to ask your questions, and I will be following the chat box throughout the webinar today. At the end of the webinar, I will be copying the link to our feedback form into the chat box also. Please be kind enough to complete it for us. We really like to get your feedback, and it helps us continuing improving. So let me now introduce our speaker, who is Ariane van Duren, the co-author of Diversity Competence, Cultures Don't Meet, People Do, together with Edwin Hoffman, who originally developed the TOPOI model, which is what his topic is today. So let me turn it over to Ariane. It's all for you.
All right. Thanks very much, Linda, for that introduction. And thank you on forehand for helping facilitate this, this webinar, especially since, Linda will be in the background reading all the chats and putting my attention to anything that comes by. So very briefly about myself and why I am here today. Very thankful on forehand for the opportunity from SIETAR Europe. So thanks very much for the online hospitality to do this webinar. So very briefly, so my name is Ariane van Duren, from the Netherlands, living in Sweden, having worked for over 12 years or so as an intercultural trainer and consultant for a knowledge institute known as the Royal Tropical Institute, with the training department known as KIT Intercultural Professionals, and I remain associated with them on a distance. But right now, my day job is here in Sweden at the University of Gothenburg, which is where we are right now, where I teach in the International Master's Program, mainly also in courses on intercultural communication. And the reason I am here today is to talk about, well, the title already gave it away, the TOPOI model and diversity competence. Cultures don't meet, people do. And yeah, as Linda already mentioned, that title is now completely randomly chosen. Whoops, that went a bit too fast. Because it's also the title of the book that I co-authored with Edwin Hoffman, and that was released earlier this year. We just changed around the order of the words a bit for today, because I would like to focus on the TOPOI model, as I think it's the most concrete tool, the most useful tool perhaps that, especially for fellow trainers, but also for lecturers, that could come in handy during your own work and during your own sessions. So the diversity competence will always be there in the background, let's say, and it will be relevant here and there as well. And this tagline of cultures don't meet, people do, in one way you could say kind of summarizes the kind of general approach or the kind of general vision or philosophy, if you will, that we advocate in the book. And that may sound like an obvious statement, but we believe that it kind of conveys a lot of important kind of both theoretical and practical notions. Now, before we get started and delve into the model, just a very quick introduction of what we're going to be talking about today. And I would like to start with mentioning again that basically I'm not only representing myself, but I'm talking in both the name of myself and Edwin, who is in a session, another session right now. A live face-to-face session. So that's why I'm here in the webinar. And it's maybe good to mention that TOPOI is not completely new. Edwin developed that in the 1990s of the last century, and eventually obtained his PhD on it. And before, basically most of the publications that he wrote were, first of all, in Dutch, and second of all, related to, let's say, interactions in Dutch multicultural society. So what we wanted to do with this publication was, first of all, write something in English, and second of all, kind of open up the scope to a broader sector, a broader amount of sectors that could be relevant. As the first books mainly dealt with, let's say, healthcare and social work, we wanted to involve issues of, let's say, international business or international development or international cooperation as well. Another thing that's maybe good to mention is that model and the approach in our whole book basically builds on what is known as a constructivist approach to culture and interculturality, sometimes also called a non-essentialist approach. For those of you that were in the last SIETAR webinar by Milton Bennett, if you weren't, I would highly recommend watching it back. I think Milton said a lot of interesting things, and in many ways we build on the same kind of paradigm of understanding and approaching culture. To put it very briefly, it is a approach to culture that doesn't basically take cultures for granted, doesn't really see them as objective facts, believes it's, culture is a relevant social force, but that basically all the concepts and the ideas that we use to understand culture, we need to keep in mind that we construct those ideas and these concepts. And in a way, we need to also be aware that these ideas and concepts are developed in a certain societal context, relating to partly to power differences, to power inequalities. That's something we need to be aware of when we use a word like culture and all the labels that we've developed to realize where these labels come from. And at the same time, on the micro level, a constructivist approach means that we assume that people kind of construct their cultural experience in a certain context, in a certain situation. So it's not a given what people's culture is, but people kind of construct their experience based on the situation, based on the people that they're talking to. And that's, in a kind of complex situation where culture comes into play. That will become hopefully clearer when we move along. Another thing to mention is that the model, but also the book in general, aims at what we call intercultural interaction. And by that we mean that our starting point is not culture per se and the understanding of culture per se, but trying to understand the interaction between people of different cultural backgrounds, trying to understand what factors come into play, why people possibly misunderstand each other, what is kind of the process that people go through. And that stands, for instance, in comparison to an approach that would focus on what you could call cross-cultural transitions, so the phenomenon that people, excuse me, move from one place to the other and kind of need to adapt to a new social context. Of course, there's some overlap between these two phenomena, but we believe that there is a significant different focus that kind of justifies a bit of a different approach as well. And last but not least, whenever I talk to TOPOI, talk about TOPOI to fellow trainers and to colleagues, I always try to emphasize that there is a kind of danger of instrumentalization of the instrument. So I noticed that sometimes people interpret TOPOI as a kind of tool, which it is, but that can persuade people to TOPOI every single situation and believe that every situation needs to be TOPOI'd. What I would like to emphasize today, that TOPOI is mainly a certain vision and a certain approach to intercultural communication, where the actual model, the actual areas where the abbreviation TOPOI stands for, in a way is a kind of last resort to help you. It should not be the starting point of an interaction. It should not be the starting point of any kind of communication. Okay, just very briefly about how we'll be using our time. So honoring that last fact of the danger of instrumentalizing TOPOI, I would like to start with a couple of theoretical backgrounds that we think are very important to kind of involve, to kind of understand. And if you use this approach with participants, it would be important that people in some way have been introduced to these concepts, or at least aware of these concepts. So we'll start there. And I have told Linda to bring it to my attention if there is a question in the chat that relates to clarification. So if something is unclear for whatever reason, and I'll put that up to Linda to decide if that would be a question that I can answer in a couple of seconds, then we'll do it along the way. Otherwise, the more deeper questions that need a little bit more discussion, I would like to save to around halfway, where we can also hopefully see some overlap between the questions, because there's quite many of you out there, to see if we can address them a bit group-wise, about halfway. Then I would like to get into the actual model and the different areas that that model consists of. I'll give you a quick introduction, and that will be the start, or the reading ground, let's say, for hopefully interactive case discussion. So we'll try to apply all these ideas and the model on hopefully 2 cases if we have time. I'm trying to do very strict time management with myself here. And then if there is some time left, let's be optimistic today, then we can do another Q&A in the end. Okay. Before we continue, we had this idea of involving you in a different way by doing a quick poll. So most of the theoretical fields will be introduced with a quick poll. So if Linda would be so kind to introduce the poll.
Yeah, Ariane, before I introduce the poll, I have more than one person online here who would really like to know what the acronym stands for and what is the definition of TOPOI. Can we do that now or after the poll?
If you don't mind, because we'll get to that quite thoroughly when we're about halfway, when we introduce the TOPOI areas.
Okay.
We'll go full on to the acronym and the different areas, and I'm not sure if it'll be a definition, but a description of what it means.
Okay. So for everyone, I'm going to, give me 1 second here, launch our first question to you. Can you indicate to me in the chat box that you do have it on your screen?
I have it on my screen at least.
Do our participants have it? Okay. Oh, good. We've got it. Answers are coming in, Ariane.
Yep.
And when we put the end, I think I'll be able, we'll leave 1 more minute.
Yes.
According to my counts, there are 60 of you online here today. Do you think we're ready to stop?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll and we will be able to look at the results. So we have 98% who chose we. Yes, sorry, I'm in France. Intercultural learning should make people aware of the impact of culture on behavior and ideas, as opposed to B, 35%. Intercultural learning should make people aware of stereotypes and us versus them thinking.
Okay.
So 98%, I don't know how we got 98 and 35, which is over 100%, but hey.
That's interesting.
Yes.
That's just because there's a lot of people, I guess.
Yes, maybe people answered twice. I don't know. They answered once and then went back and said, I'm not sure. Anyway, I will close that.
Well, let's hope that confusion at least indicates something interesting, because I
Yeah.
guess I can imagine if a lot of people would have had the option of both, a lot of people would have mentioned that. But yeah, then it would have been not such an interesting poll, perhaps, which is why I made you choose and made you think about it. So the idea was to kind of reflect on what do I prioritize, what do I emphasize. So this question relates to the first, let's say, theoretical notion, which is about culture itself. And this title is the same as the first one of our book, which is Culture is Everywhere and Nowhere. Basically, the whole first chapter of the book relates to this. And as an intercultural trainer, basically, how I would frame that is to say that our approach to culture basically has as a goal to stimulate a specific kind of culture awareness. And it's a specific kind of culture awareness that also underlies the TOPOI model. And that basically has two goals. And the first goal of that cultural awareness basically is to counter what is known as ethnocentrism. Many of you know what that is, which is, right, this is this tendency, the human tendency to kind of assume that your own worldview and your own logic and your own way of doing and seeing things is the normal and logical and natural way. And a nice way to illustrate that, I always feel, is by this world map, which shows you that it's both kind of arbitrary which part of that map is in the middle, but even more so, it's quite arbitrary which part of the map is up or which is down. Like if we go into space, there's no gravity. It's not completely clear which is up or down, which kind of reminds you how often we take our own worldview, literally in this case, for granted. And I think it's fair to say that if you try to look at the whole history of intercultural methods and intercultural theory, a lot of it has implicitly or explicitly emphasized countering this ethnocentrism. And by all means, I think that's still very legitimate and still very necessary. At the same time, we're saying that as we see it, there is another learning goal, which relates rather to the second question, where we could say, at least in our phrasing, another learning goal is countering something called essentialism, another term that many of you are familiar with, where you could say essentialism is the tendency to kind of think of cultures as these phenomena that have this clear essence that lies underneath it. And if you would kind of lift the lid of a box, let's say this cultural box, so you would look underneath and there would be like these people underneath this lid that all look kind of the same. And they're all affected by that essence in the same way. And I think this at the same time is something that needs to be countered, because this is in many ways something that could lead to stereotyping, obviously, believing that there's this essence that makes it all the same, which also leaves very little space for similarities. And implicitly, we know this from social psychology, if we don't see any similarities, we are very vulnerable to this kind of us and them thinking. So then it's important to, aside from all the notions that we tell people and our participants to avoid ethnocentrism by actually, instead of saying that if you would lift the lid of the box where everyone looks the same, that cultures, when we look at them more closely, rather look like this picture, this mosaic, where on the one hand, yes, we can recognize a clear pattern, but at the same time, there are very different colors and sizes and placings of the different people in that group and the different people in that pattern. And in this case, the pattern also suggests movement to remind us that cultures are always developing, always changing, and it's important to keep a dynamic conceptualization of culture.
Ariane, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I have to interrupt again. We have a few people who are having difficulty with the sound and hearing you. So I'd like to ask you maybe to direct really straight towards your microphone and speak up possibly a little bit. We'll see if that will help people who are having difficulty. I have someone who says, yes, please louder.
Please louder, okay.
Yes, that sounds better already.
I'll put on my lecturing voice. I hope my colleagues next door don't mind, but I'm sure they don't. I'll try to do that. Having said that, I would like to go to the next poll for time's sake to introduce the next theoretical notion.
Okay, answers are coming in. I'm going to try to leave a little bit more time this time, because some people felt it went too fast for the last one. So answers are still coming in. As I see, we must have about 65 participants with us today.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. Answers seem to have stopped coming in.
All right.
So I will end that. And I will share the results.
Okay. Interesting.
All right. So 96%.
Right. So this is a bit more clear cut than the previous answer. And I would say that, yeah, fair enough. I would say the convention or the consensus in social science is also to recognize that culture is a factor of relevance for basically any human group, right? So aside from nationality, ethnicity, and religion, obviously regions, cities, organizations, generations are all characterized by a certain culture. Now, why is that relevant? Because I think if we look at intercultural interactions, on the one hand, in our field of intercultural communication, obviously, I think it's fair to say that many of us focus on interactions between people of different national, ethnic, and religious backgrounds, which there's nothing wrong with that. We can have a different discussion about how broad that scope could be, but I think on the one hand, it's fair to have that focus, and we have that focus in our book as well. But I think at the same time, it's kind of essential to recognize that in those interactions, even if we focus on inter-ethnic, international, and interreligious interactions, there can be all kinds of different cultural factors at play. So if we would zoom in on an individual, and this is an example I always like to use with my students, this is an underground rapper from the USA that goes by the name of Brother Ali. You can see all his different identities and hence his participation basically in different cultural fields. You would see that just trying to understand him by pointing to the fact that he's American would give you a very limited understanding of things. So one thing in the model that we try to do is encourage people to look beyond just national, ethnic, and religious cultures, and try to wonder what other kind of identities and cultural group memberships could explain who someone is, how someone behaves, how to relate to someone. What that does basically is it gives you a broader picture of people, enables you to see not only differences, but also similarities in basically any interaction, which also creates a better breeding ground for building connections, for building common ground. We also know from a lot of research that as soon as people manage to get a fuller and more complex picture of someone, it kind of decreases the kind of anxiety that people can feel in an intercultural situation when they have this feeling, oh, I know nothing about this person, how can I ever relate? So in the TOPOI model, we very much encourage people to go beyond this first impression that we might have and try to get a fuller picture of who people are. Having said that, I think we're ready for the next poll.
All right. Coming up. There we go. Excuse me. And so here we are to everyone. Question 3. So I have people saying, have you gotten them now? Because for me, it's...
I see the poll up on the screen.
Okay, yes, so people are... I had a couple of comments in the chat that they couldn't see them. Okay. And we're up to 54 responses of 66 participants. I don't see any other movement. We have people who say that both statements are valid. I can't choose between the two. So I'm going to put an end to it.
All right.
And here are the results. So,
Right.
and Ariane, you do see the results, right?
You see the results, yeah.
Okay.
So, which again add up to over 100%. Let's just say we're having a different cultural logic today than the logic that 100% is the maximum, right?
Yeah, well, we've got, some people did, I think it's a little bit, I will take responsibility for not having understood when I entered the question that I should have limited it to one answer for each question. But we do have people here who have said both statements are valid for me.
Mm. Mm. Right. Well, I mean, again, here the intention was also a little bit to create some confusion and to create some reflection. And I would like to give a bit of a nuanced answer to how we reason about this, which relates back to this triangle, or this set of triangles that many of you will recognize, basically first phrased by anthropologist Murray and Kluckhohn in 1951. And as many of you will know, Geert Hofstede built his kind of pyramid on that basis as well. And we're giving it another twist, our own twist as well, by saying that if we try to understand people's behavior and differences and similarities between people, then we would start at the bottom by pointing at human nature and common humanity, where you're like all other people, where there's universal needs, emotions, and competencies, right? Which may sound obvious, but I think what we see very often in intercultural situations is that we forget this, right? We have this feeling, oh, someone is different, that maybe has to do with culture. We feel disoriented, we don't know what happens. Whereas in many situations, there might also be aspects of just common humanity involved, where maybe it's good to know that if we would ask evolutionary psychologists, they would find that the overwhelming majority of our behavior is actually caused by our humanity, maybe not so much by culture. That's a matter of debate, but maybe good to know that that argument is out there, at least in some social scientific circles. On the other hand, of course, there is this level of culture which is very relevant, where again, we would emphasize that people are members of different cultures at the same time, and that within a certain cultural group, you're like some other people. And how we would like to approach that is to say that, at least on the interaction level, what culture does is it gives people a repertoire of ideas, of behaviors and symbols. Why is that word repertoire important for us? Because it represents that, on the one hand, we have very limited freedom, what repertoires we have access to. So for example, as a Dutch person living in Sweden, I don't have very easy access to what we could call a Japanese repertoire. Or since I'm not a very active yogi, I don't really have a very good access to what we could call yoga culture. But I have considerable freedom in how I apply the repertoire that I have access to. So it gives me different behaviors, different scenarios, different ways of dealing with things. How I apply that repertoire in a specific situation with a specific person, there I have some freedom of choice of how I respond and what I do. Not limitless freedom, of course, but some freedom. Which also plays into the last level, where we look at individuals, where you say you're like no one else, where we see not only that people, because of these different cultural group memberships, have a kind of unique composition of the groups they are members of, but also can process these group memberships and these repertoires in a kind of unique way. Which leads to the fact, again, of the statement, if cultures don't meet, people do. And of course, a question I very often get, isn't it then valid that I can still recognize an individual, that people have, that a person has certain characteristics of a certain nationality? And of course we can, right? I mean, I can have a colleague who's German, and I could recognize patterns in his or her behavior that I experience as typically German. But that's not to say that another German person would have processed that repertoire in the same way, and would choose the same things of that repertoire that in the end up in this person's daily behavior. And that just recognizing the fact that that behavior might be typically German as such, and I think that's very important, does not necessarily solve a problem if we would have some issue in our interaction. So that's why the statement, cultures don't meet, people do, for us important, because of course we need to value the fact that people individually are influenced by culture or by cultures. But in the actual interaction, we don't meet a culture, we meet a person. And that is, on the one hand, more complex, because it means that we can't really use a recipe of, if I know that a person is a member of this culture, this is how to behave. But at the same time, it is in a way easier because it gives us the ability to negotiate, to kind of explore, to inquire, and to assume that everyone has the ability to make some reasonable adaptations in their behavior. which comes to the end of this slide. And I would like to introduce the next poll.
I'm coming.
Good.
So we are on number, this is the last one then, right, Ariane?
Correct.
And there we go, everyone. It's funny watching the poll because you see it says if only 4 people have answered and they all answered the same thing, then what we have is 100%. But that's not a true, it's not a true interpretation of the results.
It could also mean, again, that a lot of people find it difficult to vote.
Yeah.
Which I think would be a good thing in this case again.
Okay. I think I am going to end here. And here are the results.
All right. Okay. It's divided and it shows a clear preference though for answer B, which I would say is also a bit the default answer in our circles of interculturalists. And I think what this points to, what these questions pointed to, is this issue of ethics, which I think is a relatively unexplored issue in our field. So what we did in our book is to say that on the one hand, we made this bold statement that we state that intercultural interactions are not necessarily and always more challenging than interactions that we don't call intercultural. And I think that we should be aware of that as interculturalists also, that we do not always a priori problematize intercultural interactions and kind of contribute to a discourse that makes people feel that, oh, I need to be very wary and a bit careful about intercultural interactions because it can be very difficult. I think they are definitely not always are, but if they are, our argument is that very often it's because they lead to dilemmas around ethics or because they have to do with power issues. And concerning ethics, what we try to do is to give an overview of different ways and different basically systems of thought about ethics in intercultural situations, which would be in situations where basically, people have different values or different ideas of different behaviors that kind of clash and that are not basically that can't go together. And that leads to an ethical situation. And historically, you could say, if I cut a very long story short of history of philosophy, you could say there's 2 main systems of thought about intercultural ethics. And the first one is what is often called universalism, which represents basically the search or the belief in a single truth, in a single morale that basically encompasses all other systems. So that would be represented by this picture where you can tell that, yes, there are different shapes and there are different colors, but there's one color that encompasses them all. And that would represent, again, a kind of universal system of beliefs and thoughts that gives you the criteria and the notions to judge vis-a-vis culture, to judge behavior and phenomena in any culture, irrespective of what that culture is. Now, that's not necessarily the default way of thinking, I would say, in interculturalism, But I would like to point out that that system has a merit because one of the intentions, you could say, behind it is a kind of sense of justice and equality for people, no matter what culture they belong to or supposedly belong to. So there is a good intention in there. Of course, where it gets problematic, and that's basically when universalism derails into monism, is as soon as people start to believing that that one universal superior system of belief happens to be mine, right? Which is when people start to discredit any other way of thinking and doing because it's not like theirs, and all those systems are backward and my system is superior. So that historically basically led to this counter movement of relativism that Milton talked about extensively last week, where people start to say, hang on a minute, there's not one truth, but there's different truths and different morals. And we need to be relativistic, which means that we can only judge behavior ideas in their own context. And it is very difficult, if not impossible, to judge anything if you're not yourself a part of that. And again, I think historically we need to realize that this was, in a way, a response. It was a response to colonialism, for example. And it made sense, maybe in a way, if you would kind of envision the world as a kind of, literally, as you see here, archipelago of different cultural islands. But now that we live in this very interconnected world with all these mutual interdependencies, it can be difficult to uphold. And as Milton already pointed out, in terms of interaction, actually, if you take this very literally, there's actually nothing in the system that makes you even want to engage with someone else, because if you take it to an extreme, you would never be able to understand someone from another context anyway. And ethically, I think what we very often see, it leads to a kind of moral vacuum where we believe that we can never judge behavior in another group, which can become problematic if we see that there can be injustices within groups or across groups without us having any kind of criterion to judge this. So as a kind of synthesis, we would follow the ideas of a Dutch philosopher called Henk Proce that coined the term pluralism to build basically on the merits of both of these systems by saying, yes, of course, there can be different ways of seeing the world. And that is a good thing, because the truth, whatever it is a constantly developing concept. We constantly need to keep broadening our scope of the world, broadening our understanding of the world. There can never be one definitive, all-encompassing truth. So we need to encourage differences. We need to acknowledge differences, because any kind of progress or innovation often comes from bringing together different perspectives. At the same time, these truths and these worldviews can overlap. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Remember the bottom of the pyramid, where there are certain things that are fundamentally human. And we can recognize things in each other. We can dialogue, we can converse, we have the ability to exchange and to talk. Which leads to the fact that he mentions two transcultural minimum norms ethically, which is on the one hand, respect for human dignity, which means non-exclusion, which means no one on the basis of any cultural or religious argument could ever be excluded from interaction a priori. And the other one will be enhancement of interaction by saying this could only work if we are willing to explain to each other why we do the things we do. So,
I have a request, Ariane, for you
yes,
to repeat the name of the Dutch philosopher.
sure, that is Henk Proce, H-E-N-K, as his first name, Henk, and Proce is P-R-O-C-E-E. He went into his retirement a couple of years ago. I'm not sure how much he's published in English. Without sounding too self-involved, we try to give a decent overview of his thoughts in our book in English, if this is for an English speaker.
Sorry, I have typed it into the chat box for anyone who wants it.
Excellent. So just to summarize, it's a system that emphasizes the ability to have dialogue, the ability to exchange and learn from each other. And obviously that in many intercultural situations, we need to suspend judgment, which doesn't always mean we need to withhold judgment. And those are two different things. Okay, moving on, just one more thing I would like to get out of the way before we go to the Q&A and the model is our approach to communication, which we call circular, which means that if you look at this double helix, it means that people are constantly influencing each other. So it's an approach where we assume that what I do influences you, what you do influences me. So let's say that I would be a team manager and I would have an employee who doesn't speak up very much during meetings. I could think, what is it about that person that makes him act this way? And that would be valid. But I could also think, what is it about how I act that makes this person act this way, and vice versa? And what then comes into play, and that's this aspect of power that I mentioned as a critical factor, is that if you open up that circular approach even wider, we also acknowledge that there can be an influence from what we call social contexts. So our conversation that we can have doesn't take place in a vacuum, but takes place obviously in a societal or a global or an organizational context that in a way adds meaning to what we do, whether we like it or not. And very often, things like power inequalities or collective experiences or historical experiences come into play there. Just to give a very quick example, something that I've experienced often as a consultant is, let's say, a person of immigrant background in an organization gets told that he or she should adapt, and that person gets very offended and very angry, whereas that was intended in a way as you need to adapt to the rules here in this organization. But because of a kind of social discourse in a social context where it's very often problematized that these immigrants should finally adapt, and why don't these immigrants adapt, this word gets a completely different meaning. So very often in situations, it's very fruitful to be aware of the social context in which a conversation and a communication takes place. Because whether we like it or not, it can give meaning to what we say or what we do. And we'll get back to the TOPOI model, which is also built on this kind of circular understanding. And now, I would like to see where we are with questions. So Linda, is there something?
I have one.
Bring to my attention?
Hi, there is nothing written particularly. There were comments on the question concerning universal standards and a mention from Kirsten Kilinowski, excuse me if I'm massacring your name, that universal standards such as human rights and equality for everyone are often or may be considered a very Western approach. And the comment from someone that in the questions, neither is completely clear. I also have a hand raised from Farzana Islam, and I'm going to let you talk. Now, this is not something, Farzana, let me find you again. My screen is jumping, I'm very sorry. Farzana, you put your hand down. Do you no longer wish to speak? I had a raised hand and it's gone down.
Okay.
Someone is anxious. Okay, I have no hands, and I have someone asking, could you please do the TOPOI model?
Right, I see that as well.
Okay.
It might be a good thing to do. Just very briefly concerning the discussion about human rights as Western. I think that's a point for discussion. If you actually look at the history of human rights, it's not as simple as it seems. So I think it is a valid point, I think, to reflect upon that. In our book, we give a short overview of the development of human rights and the kind of philosophical discussion about it. The only thing I'll say now is it is a little bit more complicated than saying that. And in practice, I think what happens very often is it's often appropriated by the West as something typically Western, whereas I think that is very questionable, and that does something to the debate as such. Because if we say, we developed this and you need to adapt to that, that gives a certain dynamic to the discussion, which doesn't honor the complexity. But I would like to honor that request to go to TOPOI, also looking at the time. So very briefly, you can read this later. The ideas behind TOPOI model are the following. I won't go into them for time's sake, but just again to remind you that there's a danger of instrumentalizing it. The main idea of TOPOI is to bring people into a certain mind state and try to encourage them to take up a certain approach of intercultural interaction and communication. So very briefly, finally, the acronym that you are wondering about, TOPOI. Basically, so very briefly, what TOPOI does is it gives you an instrument, again, which is not...
Ariane, I'm sorry. Did you have something to project? Because we don't have your presentation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or, yeah.
My apologies for that. How about now? Is this better?
We've got it, yes.
Okay, good. So, so very briefly, the TOPOI model is a way of engaging with miscommunication as it occurs. So the intention is not to a priori TOPOI every single situation, every interaction. The idea, again, is to approach intercultural communication as communication between people that apply their repertoires, that have some ability to reflect, they can find some middle ground where it's not necessarily only a dilemma between mere acceptance or mere adaptation, but there's an ability in a communicative situation to exchange, to learn, and to deal with differences constructively. So only if that approach fails, you could say, and a situation presents itself that seems more difficult to solve or to understand, would we recommend to kind of visit these fields. Now, obviously, at the same time, the more often you do that, the kind of more versatile you become and the more sensitive you become to these different fields as they occur. Within the context of a training, I normally use it mainly for discussing case situations and analyzing case situations. So what TOPOI does, it gives you different areas or different fields, different vantage points, you could say, to look at a miscommunication and to see where that comes from. Asking for every field the questions, what does each person share? Again, thinking of this circular approach to communication where we all influence each other, and what the influence is of the social context. And it looks at tongue, which is the verbal and nonverbal language, at order, which has to do with people's different views and logics, with persons, which relates to people's identities and relationships, with organization, about the organizational and societal context, and with people's intentions in terms of motives, emotions, values, and needs. Another way to look at it, Edwin just came up with this approach to say TOPOI is a kind of lens that helps you zoom into a situation. And instead of, this experience that people have of thinking, oh, it's culture, now I don't know what to do, or to think, oh, I should adapt or he should adapt, my way or the highway, it helps you to kind of zoom in and make the differences more concrete and try to figure out communicatively where a misunderstanding or an experience of strangeness or discomfort actually comes from. Now, very briefly, if you would sum it down to a couple of main questions, tongue is about basically on the level of messages and how they're communicated, again, in terms of language, what language are we even speaking, but also in terms of nonverbal language and body language, order in terms of the different views and logics at play. Persons would be the question, how do people actually perceive each other and approach each other? Again, think of all these different identities. What are the things that we pick out? What kind of interaction are we creating by emphasizing a certain identity in ourselves or in the other? On the level of organization, what is the role of the kind of organizational societal context, which is very often overlooked in my experience, by the way. And on the level of intentions, what drives people? What makes them involved in the situation, and do they actually recognize each other's intentions? Where also the idea is that you can recognize each other's intentions without necessarily agreeing with it, but do people feel heard in what they want to achieve? From the assumption that basically behind every behavior generally is good intentions, which doesn't mean it's a good intention for you, but it makes sense for that person involved. What you need to keep in mind is all these fields can overlap, right? So when we do an analysis, the point is not like, oh, this is the first O or the second O, let's have a discussion. The point is it helps you to open up the scope in a situation and try to find different entry points, different interventions, different ways to understand or interpret the situation. I'm just going to go very quickly through these possible issues and make you read them. These are just examples. For tongue, what kind of things that could come into play. For order, for persons, for organization, and for intentions. And again, in my experience, often just thinking about the general main questions behind this field often brings people into position to come with all kinds of interpretations they may not have had before. And I would like to move on quickly to go to a case situation to illustrate that, which is a case situation that I engaged with several years ago as a consultant, which goes on every day basically in schools, I think, at least in the Netherlands and many other countries. And I would like you to think, what aspects of TOPOI do I recognize here? And maybe Linda, you can keep me updated. That's okay, since I can't see the chat.
Okay, I'll let you know as answers come in. We do have someone asking for examples of different views and logics within this model. If you'd like to think about bringing that up when we finish the case study.
Sure, yeah, I can do that.
So we have an answer: person and organization, order, and someone who would like you to clarify the question.
Okay.
Someone else says it's all of them. Someone says taboos. Organization, order, persons. Order, persons, organization, intentions. Order and organization. And a question: will girls and guys be separated?
That is unclear. Let's say it cannot be excluded on forehand that that will happen.
Okay, organization, order, persons, persons and trust. And someone would like to know the intention of the exercise.
Right.
We've got order, intentions, and persons. Persons, order, intentions. So
right.
if I'm right, we've got person, order, and intentions, which are maybe the top three, and organization afterwards in the overall answers.
Right. Okay. Great. I mean, first of all, what I should always say is there is not necessarily obviously a right or wrong answer in this. As a trainer, often when I use this, you know, like for instance, this case I've used many times, it happens very often that people come with an interpretation or a vantage point I've never thought about myself. So of course, as a trainer, you should feel quite fluent in the model as such. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have all the right answers or the only answers. So very often different things can come out of a case discussion, but it's a way to help people open up. Now, if I would analyze it, I think it's interesting. Noma mentioned tongue, and I didn't mention it either because I don't necessarily see anything in terms of verbal or nonverbal language going on. In terms of order, basically, respond to that question earlier, that have to do with any type of view or logic that people apply in a situation. So theoretically, you could think of all the different dimensional models, right? Thinking of different views of hierarchy or gender or individual, you know, social relationships. But it could also be a certain view coming from an historical experience or a position as a minority or majority in a certain situation. It's everything has to do with how you see the world. Now here I would say it seems like different views of what is school, what is private, different views of learning, perhaps gender roles, right? Relating to the mixed dormitories and individual responsibility at play. I agree about the trust. Yeah, so it seems, and I think that's very clear and very important in this case. You see how quickly this kind of escalates into kind of us versus them. In this case, sounds like immigrants versus natives or majority minority position, where I would say the mere knowledge of culture in this sense, I'm not sure how much that would solve or how much that would even emphasize or even yeah, kind of emphasize the differences that people are already experiencing. So mere knowledge in this case, I would say, is not necessarily the answer. On level of organization, I agree that there's a lot of things going on, because what is actually the goal of the camp? And what is mentioned is to acquire the competence cooperation, but is a camp the only way that can be achieved? Is that the only way? And if it is the only way, does that camp necessarily need to be organized in a distance from the city that doesn't enable students to travel back and forth, for which they need to stay over? And can there be other kind of solutions? I know in the end, after this was discussed thoroughly, there were students that went with their parents into a hotel nearby, slept over, and came during the day to the camp to acquire the competence of cooperation, which probably doesn't require people to stay over in dormitories. On the level of intentions, what you see is that motivations are not really explored or inquired, but people draw their conclusions on kind of minimal knowledge, where people would say, you know, here and no further, let's draw a line. Instead of kind of acquiring what the issue exactly is. And I think that is a kind of dynamic that we need to recognize and to deal with. Looking at the time, I'm just going to very quickly show you the other case.
Ariane, we have one question. What about the teachers taking this as a chance to cooperate? Is a question posed for the previous case study. And yes, we have approximately 3 minutes left on our time.
Would you say this is, maybe we should just move to questions, Linda? Is that a good suggestion?
I think maybe when we don't have enough time for the second one, I would answer maybe Ursula's question and see if anyone else would like to type in a question or comment.
Let's do that. Which
was, what about the teachers taking this as a chance to cooperate with the students and their parents?
Yeah, I think that would be a great suggestion. Yeah, that is in a way a little bit what was the outcome of that situation. What happened is that this case was brought forward to what is called an educational advisor in this university or in this college, where he or she was kind of pressured to give the answer about what to do on the level of policy, where in the end, after we discussed this, the conclusion was, well, this is maybe not about what kind of policy, because you can't always have a policy for everything. But indeed, yeah, absolutely. I would say cooperation between the students and the teachers of what is it exactly that we're trying to achieve in this program or with this camp, or generally for this profession that people are being prepared for. And how does this play a role in there? I hope that answers Ursula's question. Okay, good.
Sorry, Ursula says yes. Oh, are you looking at the chat now?
I'm looking at the chat now.
Okay.
Was that the conclusion? The conclusion was multifold. The conclusion was that yes, it is important for students to participate in this camp, not only for the cooperation, but also for the mutual introduction of getting to know each other better. But yes, there was much more flexibility in how to deal with that. They, this year, had booked the camp, so it was organized far away, but there was indeed flexibility about whether or not to stay over. And I know in the following years, they just planned the camp closer to the city where the university was. So it was up to the students to decide if they wanted to stay over or not. Maybe have the other case study. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, Linda, can we share the slides with people that participated so that they have the full slides available? Is that possible?
I'm not quite sure. I would have to check into that. The problem we have obviously is with the new personal data situation and people's email addresses. However, if you project the slide, Ariane, it then becomes part of our recording, and it will be on the website and YouTube as part of today's webinar. Okay.
I also got the suggestion, just put it on the slide and take a screenshot.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, I can do that very quick. But I think people can hang around afterwards, right after we close the seminar.
For a few minutes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's do that. So, I mean, if just stick around afterwards, and I'll quickly just put it on, and you can see it. And I'll put these.
Well, now the thing is I'm going to have to turn the recording off. So recommend that you go ahead and show it now.
Oh, okay. Let's do that.
And then we have a couple questions that we can go over a few minutes to discuss.
Okay, let's do that. Resume share. Should work.
We have your screen now. We just don't have it on full screen, and it's not on the correct slide.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. This is the case. I'll just give you some time to find the right key combination for the screenshot.
So I hope everyone has it. And then we have,
Sorry, yeah, you go ahead, Linda. You're in charge.
Well, I saw two last questions.
Sure.
How would you have used this model to help the people in this case? And that's the first case.
I mean, of course, it does rely on a kind of willingness of people to reflect and to think, right? So in this case, the person that came forward to us was the study advisor that was confronted with this case and had to advise on it. But I've had other situations where there was more or less a conflict situation, where of course there needs to be a willingness for people to reflect. If there's no willingness for people, then it's very difficult. Then very often it helps to kind of present the model, in my experience, and present the fields and let people themselves kind of analyze the situation. So it's not me as a trainer that says, oh, you need to be aware of the P or you need to be aware of the O, but it helps people themselves to kind of reflect and analyze their situation, where again, it needs to come from a willingness to reflect. But I think that goes for many interventions or many even mediation attempts, that willingness is a prerequisite.
And then we have someone who says, isn't the TOPOI model a model for communication? Couldn't it be used, hang on, aren't you able to use it just in regular communication scenarios?
Yeah, this is a discussion we have very often. Yes, absolutely. So the TOPOI model is, I didn't have time for that, but is an adaptation of a general approach to communication by Václavík, a very famous communication scholar. And it's basically a kind of translation or an adaptation of that to specifically intercultural situations. But it is fair to say that it could be applied in any kind of interaction or any kind of communication. Theoretically, it is quite hard. I won't go into detail, but theoretically, it's quite hard to very specifically argue what distinguishes an intercultural situation from a non-intercultural situation. So yeah, I would say it is, yeah. But the main thing is that I think it helps you, again, to kind of walk away from this overwhelming intercultural experience where you say, look, I don't know what to do. There's different culture involved. I don't know what their, what their values are and how they think and how they reason, into a communicative situation where you can analyze what is actually creating the misunderstanding, what is actually creating the disruption. I hope that answers the question, Gloria.
Okay, I think I'm going to call a close to the webinar. I've typed in several times the link to our feedback form. Please give it to us. And I want to remind everyone as last note that December 10th will be our next and last webinar of the year, how psychological contracts work and how they can influence the success or failure of international assignments. To Ariane, I want to say thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you all for coming.
And thank you, everyone, for attending. We have very much appreciated it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And just a last note, if you want to get in touch, here's my contact details. If you had a question that I didn't get to answer, and you're burning for an answer, please, feel free to drop me a line. I'm very happy to continue the conversation.